As we saw in the last episode of this podcast, Septimius Severus, a man I call a warlord, won the right to rule the Roman Empire alone by facing down two other claimants and surviving the year of the five emperors, AD 193. By 197, Septimius was in charge, having defeated his last rival for power in Gaul and exacting a punitive campaign of terror, sacking Roman cities that were disloyal to him and executing 29 Roman senators and outright stealing the wealth and estates of several more. Long gone were the days of Marcus Aurelius and his predecessors. Long gone was the Pax Romana. The reign of Septimius Severus gives us a sense of the new Roman order and also foreshadows even darker days to come. We'll talk about it on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 60, The Emperor Septimius Severus. As we saw last time, Septimius Severus entered Rome in AD 197, a conqueror, not of some foreign people or external enemy, but of armies of Romans, led by usurpers who, just like him, tried to secure the title of emperor by force of arms. When he arrived in the capital of the empire, Septimius terrified the Senate into submission, executing 29 prominent senators, giving speeches defending the autocratic actions of old republicans like Sulla, the dictator, and Gaius Marius, a man that held 6 consulships in a row. In this same speech, he evidently derided an individual you might not suspect, Gaius Julius Caesar, the man whose death began this podcast all the way back in episode 1. Why did Septimius Severus speak so poorly of Julius Caesar? Well, Julius Caesar was merciful with his enemies. He let them live. He put them into prominent positions in his government in order to unify the Roman Empire by means of mercy. This was not the way that Septimius Severus would do things. Letting your enemies live, he thought, was a recipe for rebellion. And those who showed even a hint of disloyalty to his regime would find themselves at the wrong end of a Roman gladius. Septimius Severus knew how his bread was buttered. The Roman soldiers, especially his most loyal legions from Pannonia in the center of the Roman Empire, had won the empire for him, and he rewarded them abundantly, paying out a cash bonus to his troops of 1,000 sesterces each. Not a huge number, but there were, after all, as many as 100,000 men that would have received this gift. And in addition to this one-time bonus, he permanently raised soldier salaries by 400 sesterces each year. This would move their salary from 1,200 sesterces to 1,600. Now, if you've been following the last few episodes of this podcast, you know that emperors had been running short of money for more than a decade now. So the question, of course, is where did Septimius Severus get the funds to pay for these huge military expenses? Part of the answer lies in the estates confiscated from these so-called rebellious senators that Septimius executed. Some of the money also no doubt came from the cities that Septimius allowed his soldiers to sack. But in a trend-setting action, Septimius debased the Roman silver coinage, taking out about half of the silver that was left over from the debasements under Commodus and Didius Julianus. In addition to giving the soldiers massive pay rises, Septimius also improved the social conditions of soldiers as well. As you may remember from some of the episodes on the Roman military, episodes 44, 45, and 46, Roman soldiers were not allowed to marry. Any children they had would therefore be illegitimate, and they also would not be able to pass on inheritances while they were actively serving. Septimius Severus changed all of this, allowing soldiers to legally marry, legitimizing any children they had or would have, and of course giving them legal rights to pass on their land and money and anything else to those same children. Septimius Severus allowed soldiers to flaunt the wealth that they had obtained in no small part by looting their own people, allowing soldiers to wear golden rings on their fingers. And while soldiers previously had to pay for their own supplies, Septimius awarded the soldiers an increased stipend to at least pay for their food. I think there were two aims behind these measures. One, of course, is exactly what I've said. Septimius was rewarding those who had been loyal to him. But it's not as though he was done with fighting. He may have conquered all of his internal enemies, but there remained some major external enemies to fight and hopefully to conquer as a means of obtaining glory and additional wealth. The most obvious of these was Parthia, and we've talked about them both in episode 49 and 35. So right after securing Rome through butchery and terror and securing the loyalty of his soldiers through some financial benefits and the loosening of social rules, he marched his soldiers eastward to fight the Parthians. At this point, the Parthians who controlled Persia were suffering their own crisis. The current king of Parthia, Vologases V, had supported Septimius Severus's eastern rival for power, the would-be emperor Pessinnius Niger, governor of Syria. Parthia had hoped for some stability on their western border to give them the breathing space to deal with rebellions near the Persian Gulf and in the territory of Media, a region which would now fall in the northwestern part of Iran. Septimius' soldiers blitzed into Mesopotamia, and Parthian soldiers had little choice but to retreat under the initial onslaught. Septimius gained control of the Euphrates River, using it to transport supplies and soldiers deep into Parthian territory. Septimius captured numerous sites and cities in the region: Ctesiphon, Seleucia, and even Babylon. And in that process managed to capture around 100,000 people. These, of course, would have been sold into slavery. Septimius seems to have been confident that he could craft that region into a new Roman province. He established a governor there, also made arrangements with client kings. He then moved to the north to take the city of Hatra, a city that had grown rich through the caravan, land-based trading along the Silk Roads. No doubt Septimius wanted to make a statement with this conquest. Even the great emperor Trajan, in his Parthian War, had not been able to successfully take Hatra. Septimius wanted to show that he was greater than Rome's so-called best and greatest emperor. As you might remember, that's what Trajan called himself, Optimus Princeps. But the inhabitants of Hatra had defeated a Roman siege before, and they did all they could to hold on to their city against Septimius's forces. From the city walls, the Hatrans destroyed Septimius's siege engines and inflicted major casualties on the Roman army. Cassius Dio says that the most effective weapon that the defenders had was naphtha, a flammable liquid or oil that was shot at the siege engines and groups of Roman soldiers and then lit on fire, causing huge losses of property and men, and of course inflicting terror on Septimius's soldiers. Septimius was forced initially into a temporary retreat. After regrouping, Septimius relaunched his siege, keeping his distance from the walls. Here, the inhabitants of Hatra then changed their tactics, using surprise attacks by cavalry to take out soldiers on the edges of the Roman army before retreating and vanishing. Septimius was in an interesting position. He wanted to take the city, but he did not want to destroy it. And this limited his tactics. He could not simply brutalize and destroy this city as he had done with several others. His strategy was to intimidate the city into surrender. Many of his soldiers, however, having become used to spoil and rape and destruction as an entitlement, did not approve of this strategy and were uncooperative with his commands. And so Septimius was defeated a second time, in essence, by himself. And he shifted his attention to Palestine and to Egypt, taking the title of Parthicus Maximus, that is the greatest conqueror of Parthia, withdrawing his soldiers and keeping just the northern part of Mesopotamia for his own. And even though Septimius Severus ended up without many practical gains in Parthia, From the perspective of King Vulgases, the war was a disaster. And over the next 2 decades, his entire dynasty would lose power to be replaced by the Sasanian Empire in the 220s AD. As for Septimius Severus, his Trajanic phase of trying to conquer Parthia shifted into what we might call his Hadrianic phase, and the emperor decided to tour his provinces. In 201 AD, he traveled to northern Africa, his homeland, where he campaigned against the Garamantes, a group of tribal peoples that lived in the deserts to the south of the Roman cities in North Africa. By 202 AD, Septimius Severus had captured their capital city in what is now the modern nation of Libya. And while his soldiers were down in that part of the world, just for good measure, he marched them into parts of Numidia that had yet to be conquered by the Romans. All of this in an attempt to secure Rome's frontier along the Sahara Desert. He then toured the Roman cities in the region, commissioning new building projects, and we see from numerous archaeological records, especially pottery finds and other indicators of economic prosperity, that many Roman African cities flourished during this post-Pax Romana period, despite the fact that many other parts of the empire were doing quite poorly. How much of that is due to Severus, I don't exactly know, but he and his son certainly gave Northern Africa special attention and care. Over the next few years, Septimius focused on overhauling the administration of the empire, stripping the senators of their position in Roman courts and placing the prefect of his Praetorian Guard in charge of numerous judicial matters. It's during his reign and several of the reigns that follow that we have a major increase in Roman jurisprudence, at least insofar as it is documented, and this is no doubt partly owed to Septimius Severus's reforms. But also, Septimius Severus, as an emperor fixated on the military, had very little use for the Senate. In some cases, he appointed non-senators to offices and magistracies where membership in the Senate was normally a prerequisite. Obviously, this infuriated senators, but they had no real power to do anything about it. So they just sat there and took it. But in addition to senators, there was one other group marginalized under the reign of Septimius Severus, a group that had very little formal power, but whose membership nevertheless had been growing by leaps and bounds, especially in the last half-century. As the Pax Romana was in decline and even eventually died, this group was nevertheless thriving. The group I'm talking about, of course, were the Christians. And it was not just their prosperity that irked Septimius Severus, but the fact that they refused to honor the Roman gods and their chosen emperor, Septimius himself. This would not stand.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.